folks. Welcome. This is the Halfling of the Halfling and Spaceman coming to you IRL in real life from Atomacon in North Charleston, South Carolina. And today we are very honored to be talking with our guest of honor, Grady Hendrix. Grady is a New York best-selling author of fiction, also written nonfiction, along with a friend has written a YA series. He's also a critic, now a podcaster, may or may not be working on one or two television adaptations for his books. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. It's nice to be here in North Charleston. Haven't been here for a bit.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, because I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with you, but for those who are not, if you would, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
I grew up around here in Mount Pleasant, went up to NYU in 91, 92, and have been there ever since, but still got family down here. And been in New York except for a couple of brief jaunts to other places here and there, but ever since. And been writing professionally. I was a journalist from about, 2000 or so, to about 2008 or 9, and then started writing novels in 2013.
Okay. So, and you are right here from South Carolina, so this is sort of a homecoming of sorts for you. Are you able to visit some of your old stomping grounds while you're here?
Yeah, they look so different than when I was here. I try to avoid old stomping grounds because it gets me depressed about how long it's been and how much they've changed. But I see a lot of family when I'm down here and some people I still know around here. So, yeah. Yeah,
I get the same feeling when we visit our old college, which is not even the same name anymore. It's no longer Elon College. It's Elon University. University, they went big, So I get you when you say it's a little depressing. Well, we have heard from a lot of writers that they start at a very young age. We've had people that have said, they started writing when they are 3 or 4 years old. So, when did you start writing? And it not professionally, but just.
I was a big reader as a kid rather than a writer. And then mostly in high school and college, I was doing theater. Which was what I was into. And then I rapidly realized if you're doing theater, mostly what you do is make people show up on time and learn their lines. And so writing was something I could do where I'm not relying on anyone else. So I would say high school, I started to write a fair amount because I was writing plays and for production. But yeah, I wasn't like one of those little savant kids who's like writing at 3 years old. I was pretty lazy. I was happy to consume entertainment, not produce it at that age.
I can't imagine you being lazy as much as you do now. I can't imagine there was a lazy point in your life.
It's I don't know. I feel like you have to read a lot if you're going to write. And so I think those were the years when I was sort of taking a lot on board.
I think everybody's writing journey is individual, and it is, it is different. Well, what motivates you as a writer?
I mean, right now, what motivates me is I've got a contract, and so
that'll do it.
Yeah, and I never. When you start out writing, I started out in journalism, and it was cultural coverage. I wouldn't say it was like real journalism. It's not like covering wars or plane crashes or something. But I was doing a lot of that because I kind of fell into it, and I'd rather have been writing than working in an office, which was what I was doing at the time for a nonprofit. And then at a certain point, those jobs ended around 2008. There were no more cultural coverage jobs. The economic crisis hit, and every entertainment outlet fired as many people as they could and just beat their staff writers harder to produce more work that freelancers used to do. And so I sort of decided to double down. My only skill was typing. And so I went to Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop at San Diego for 6 weeks. And that's when I sort of got serious about writing fiction. And then from there, it was just, that was where I was committed. I didn't have other options. I was rather stupid. I didn't have a backup plan.
Yeah. So was that kind of the turning point for you that said, yeah, okay, this is what I'm going to do professionally now?
Going to Clarion? Yeah. I mean, it was, you go, up until that point, I'd been pretty shy about writing fiction. And Clarion, just about 24, 26 of you. This was 1990, gosh. No, this was 2009, I think. And I realized that I showed up a day late because I was sort of finishing some work. And I showed up a day late, and there were 24, I think, people, and they were mostly younger than I was. And they were super serious about writing fiction, and I wasn't. I felt really bashful about it. It was writing as a journalist, saying you write fiction is like, I don't know, saying you're a race car driver. Are you really, or do you just like to drive your car fast? And I realized that unless I stepped up and started taking it seriously, I was going to be the one person there not taking it. I'd be the asshole, and I didn't want to be the asshole. And so I really had to step up my game. And that really forced me to step up.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing how these things work when, you just get that challenge and suddenly,
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where you have to put yourself in uncomfortable situations over and over again. It's one reason I have a really hard time with people talking about feeling uncomfortable. I always feel like my whole life, as a journalist and moving on, like it's about being uncomfortable. It's about doing an interview with someone and trying to get prepared for that and trying to navigate that. One of the things that was sort of actually South Carolina did me a real solid in '99. Two friends of mine from high school got some money to make a documentary about the Confederate battle flag, which still flew over the State House here. And so I worked with them on that. And for 4 months, we drove all over the South interviewing people. And I'm a relatively shameless individual, but there's a point where you are going to talking your way into neo-Nazi weddings. You are sitting down with people with political beliefs radically different than yours. You are sitting down with people who are suspicious of you, people who have an agenda with you, people who sort of want to make their say, and you're really trying to put them at ease, and lots of people inviting you into their home, and just you keep saying yes to these things. I mean, I went to more church in those 3 months than I'd been to in the previous 12 years, because people would often want you to come to church with them. They'd want you to admire their machine gun collection. They'd want you to, there was lots of things. And so that really helped me get over, like, what's the point of feeling uncomfortable, And then sort of moving on from there, it was like, you just keep putting yourself in a situation. Every book I write, I feel really uncomfortable about because I'm not sure I can hack it. And that's sort of the choice you make. Am I going to do this or am I not? I mean, it's up to you, How much discomfort are you willing to put up with?
Right.
Very lucky with what we do because pretty much everybody we've interviewed, for the most part, has been somebody that, we can connect with on a basis of, do you like science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, games, dressing up in weird costumes? If you're a nerd, we connect with you no matter what your background is. But that sounds like you were doing something completely different, well out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And it was a lot of fun, but it was constant. We met this one great guy down in Florida who really smart, had a lot of interesting things to say. He was a Civil War reenactor and member of a thing that was, I don't know if it's still around, this League of the South, which was sort of a neo-secessionist group. But he was also a beekeeper. And he was like, come on out here to the bees. And I'm terrified of bees. And, okay. We suited up and went out with the bees and got stung because we didn't know what we were doing, a hell of a lot. But, it was like, okay, lump it. We're beekeeping today. So, but it was fun. Now I've been surrounded by bees in the suit, smoking out a hive. Like, after it's over with, it's fun. While you're doing it, it's terrifying.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I don't think I could do it. Bees, just no.
I would have the problem with the neo-Nazis. That would be my issue.
Yeah, and it was funny. No one was ostensibly a neo-Nazi. Like, we ran into a few here and there, but a lot of people were people whose beliefs really did start leaning into that National Socialism thing and white supremacy. And it was a real issue to kind of shut up and listen to what they had to say and speak to them on their terms rather than make an editorial statement about what you wanted to say. I think, one of the things that I always thought was really interesting is, I don't know if you all know Bob Caro, but he's written a few biographies. He's doing a big one of LBJ right now. Mm-hmm. And he says when he does interviews, he always has to tell himself to shut up because you have this, you always want to jump in and say something. And he says his notepads, and I've seen one, it's been on display, they're covered, every page of his notepads of just SU, which is him telling himself, shut up. He just writes on his notepad as he's interviewing someone over and over, shut up, shut up, shut up. You're there to listen.
That's the difference between what we do and what you did. Right. We're not interviewers. We're conversationalists. We love talking to people, and that's why we started the podcast, because we want to hear your story, but we want you to get to know us too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We're not going to tell anybody to shut up unless they start, really mouthing off in a really bad way.
The halfling will have to tell the spaceman to back off a little bit because I make too many snarky comments.
Sure. Well, that's the joy of having your own podcast.
That's exactly right. I can do whatever the halfling wants.
Well, 38 years of marriage has its privileges. Anyway, but I was just going to say my sister-in-law was a census taker at one point.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And you talk about getting into uncomfortable situations because she had to go to these homes where people viewed her with suspicion, sometimes would cuss her out and tell her, don't dare step on my property, because she was part of the government, and they had these perceptions, so she was constantly getting herself into these situations, and some of the stories that she told. So you talking about your experiences just made me think about hers. But let's switch gears and get back to your writing career.
Okay.
How long did it take you to first get published?
Well, these days, getting published is sort of a fungible term, right? I mean, I was writing short stories and flash fiction that were being, on websites, but I'm not sure that's published, I mean, it is ostensibly, you get paid for it, but I was writing nonstop from about 2009, and I made my first sale to a publisher for a book in 2012, 2013, right in there. So I was doing lots of freelance writing in there. I was, writing. When I finally got an opportunity to send something to an editor in 2013, I think, I had a couple of self-published books. I had a couple of two trunk novels. I had a lot of stuff to choose from. But yeah, my first book was 2013 and then published in 2014.
And do you think that as somebody who is, getting recognized in the field, have you found that it's gotten easier to be published? I mean, now that you've got your name recognition, are you, is it something where they will just look and say, oh, let's really take a look at this because this is from Grady and...
Well, yes and no. I mean, it sort of splits into two things. I have a much easier time now because now I have an agent. I have a sales history behind me. I've got 7 or 8 novels and other books that people can look at and sort of make an estimate of what my value is as a human being, I guess, in publishing. Like, oh, I'm worth X amount. But there's a contrast to that, which is these days. It's a lot harder for a lot of writers, and it will be eventually for me as well, because buyers for, like, say, Barnes & Noble or Amazon or wherever, who they determine, okay, you've got this book coming out. They go to a publisher comes to them. You've got this book coming out by this author on this date. We will buy X number of copies. And then that really determines your publisher's strategy. And what people do now is they look at the book scan numbers for your previous book, like the one right before what you did. So if that is low, you're screwed, even if the books before that were high. So I cannot put out a short story collection. I would love to, but I can't, because a short story collection always sells less than a novel. That's just the rules of the road. You look at Stephen King's sales even, and you'll see that stuff like Night Shift or Skeleton Crew or Needful, or Everything's Eventual, his short story collections, they sell lower numbers than his novels. They sell well, but lower numbers. But if my last thing on BookScan is a short story collection with lower sales, that's going to kill my next novel, because no one looks back. Charlaine Harris, who did the Suki Stackhouse books, I know this has really hurt her, because she's someone who sold millions and millions of books over her career. Her last book didn't do great, and no one's looking back. The buyers aren't looking back further than that. So it's a double-edged sword. Eventually, I did a book called We Sold Our Souls, which was my heavy metal horror novel. It was my third novel, my fourth book. My sales had been building. It bombed. It really did poorly, and is still as much as it's my favorite book, it's my lowest selling book. And I would not have had another book offered to me if I hadn't had a contract already and wasn't under contract, and there was one more book left on that contract, which is Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. If We Sold Our Souls had been my last book on contract, I would have gone to law school after that, because I simply couldn't have sold anything else. So it works, and it works until it doesn't, and then you're screwed.
You got to game the system, it sounds like.
Right, and there's a lot of small presses now that weren't there even 5 years ago in the way they are now. And I think, it's not always the end of the world for an author if their book doesn't sell, but it may not be the end of the world, but it's certainly a extinction level event for that world.
I actually had, back when I was in college, way back in the dinosaur age, I had a guy was in one of my classes who was paying his tuition by turning out Harlequin romances and smut. And they were all formulaic, and he would knock off about one every 2 weeks, and that's how he paid for his tuition.
Yeah, and and it's such a different publishing landscape now. Mm-hmm. I mean, those kind of paperbacks don't sell in the numbers now, even close to what they used to sell. I'm sure those were doing 30, 50, maybe even 100,000 copies each. Nowadays, that's considered New York Times bestseller category, Right. I just can't imagine writing a novel every 2 weeks, even if you're working from a template. Yeah.
On a typewriter.
Well, but at the same time, there is a rush to it. I mean, I've written big chunks of books in short periods. It's a rush, it's really a lot of fun. And he had an ulterior motive, right? He was putting his way through. He wasn't writing for the art of writing. He was writing to pay the bills.
No, he was writing trash, and he was proud of it.
Yeah. There's a satisfaction to that. I can see it.
Yeah, we at our last convention, which was just last weekend, we were talking to a publisher and author. He started his own publishing company, but he's also a writer. And I asked him the question I asked you, which was, what motivates you to write? And he said, paying the bills.
Yeah.
That's what.
Well, no one likes to hear it, but that is a big motivator. I mean, I've had times when I've been flat broke, and it's not fun. So it's one of those things where, for me, I was a book a year writer. Now I'm like a book every 2 years writer. Mm-hmm. But it's really stressful because I want to make sure it's right. I really work a lot more with my editor than is normal, I think, for some authors. Like I will take a beating and keep changing the book. And I usually go through about 3 radically different drafts of a book before I get to the third or fourth one in there that starts getting refined into the book. I've got a book coming out in January now, a witch book, and it really, the first draft had no witches in it. So it's changed a bit.
Well, there are no astronauts on this panel, but I'm a spaceman, so.
Well, we talked to an Australian writer who wrote a book called "This Is Not a Book About Benedict Cumberbatch." And it wasn't a book about Benedict Cumberbatch.
Well, but it was a book about her obsession, a passion for Benedict Cumberbatch.
Which it's a great book, by the way. If
we highly recommend it. Tabitha Carvan is the author.
Yeah, because it resonates. her journey, and I'm getting off track here a second, but it really resonates with fandom in general because it's sort of about her journey into finding, as a middle-aged woman, finding this passion that she didn't realize she had, and learning to be not just okay with it and accepting it, but to also finding like-minded community. Sound familiar with, people at a convention, fandom convention, so it really resonated with that. Didn't have a thing to do with geekdom or nerddom or anything, but we
But our hearts were with her. Even though Benedict Cumberbatch doesn't do anything for the spaceman. I appreciate his acting, but he doesn't do anything. It doesn't touch me in that way.
But we listened to it on audio and we were like, she gets it. She really gets it. She gets what we're about. Anyway, sorry, got off topic. We'll get back on topic. So tell us, because you've written in different forms, journalism, you've had short stories, novels, YA. So
Yay.
Yay. So two related questions on that. Number one, do you have a favorite form? And number two, what would you say is your most challenging?
I write books. Short stories I can do, but they're a stretch for me. I find them harder. I find writing short harder than writing long. So books are my sweet spot. And they're also, for me, the hardest. I mean, they really are a long road. And you got to have a lot of gas in the tank to write a book. I mean, there's a lot of times you're halfway through a draft and you're like, there's just not enough story here. So yeah, books, definitely. Screenplays are really, really hard because they're so concise, but books are really the sweet spot and the hard spot.
Mm-hmm.
So since you write both books and screenplays, are you a plotter or a pantser?
Both to some extent. And I think you kind of have to embrace both. Like right now, I'm sitting down with the latest draft of my book, and my editor had a lot of notes on it, and we're getting down to the wire on the deadline. And I'm doing this exercise that, I don't know if people know who Robert McKee is. He wrote this book called Story, which is sort of like the Bible for screenwriters. And it was a real crash course in story structure. But I'm sitting there right now with this book, and this is probably the fourth really seriously different draft. And I'm sort of going through it and being like, okay, what happens here? And then what happens next? And sometimes when you start writing down, like sentence by sentence, I'm going to come up with 80, 90 sentences that track out this book. You're going to start to see that there's just nothing happening here. It's just a chapter that you wanted to include because it's interesting to you, or you're working through something on your own, or you thought your writing's particularly good there. And that's the stuff where you start to cut it out and make it serve another purpose. So I go back and forth. I can pants it for a bit, but then you got to apply a little more rigor to it if you want people to be reading along. Unless you're really, if you're someone like Donna Tartt or someone, you can just write. Her writing's good enough that you'll follow it wherever. I'm not that good of a stylist, so I have to really make sure I'm delivering something that's pulling people through.
Have you ever had a project that you started working on and you got so frustrated and just made the decision that this is not going to happen, I'm not getting it, this is not going to work, and you just got rid of it?
Never.
Nope, not doing it.
No, I can't. For me to walk on a book means that the year of my life I've spent on it goes out the window. There's no return on it. I can't live like that. You know what I mean? And so I have to make it work. I have to find a way. If that means radically rethinking it, I radically rethink it. If that means I've got to do something completely different here, I do, but I can't walk on it. I've had books get canceled before. And we sold Our Souls, which I was talking about. After a year of working on it, it got canceled by my publisher. And then I basically, in 9 days between my editor making the decision to cancel it and that decision being conveyed to the rest of the office, because it was over the Christmas, New Year's holiday, I rewrote the book and gave it back to him in a way that he sort of was okay. He's like, okay, we can work with this now. But I realized I had from December 30th to January, I think it was 11th was the Monday. It was just a weird way and publishing's a kind of lazy industry where people take long vacations. So I had like 11 or 12 days and just rewrote the book.
Is it ever like doing physics homework where you know you don't want to do it, but you gotta?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's where I am right now with the book I'm doing, is that the idea, I've been wrestling with this book for a year straight. I think the first draft was September of 2022. And I've spent, over a year, and going back to it hurts, but I have to. If I want it to work, I got to go back. Okay. So, a lot of my job is making myself sit in a chair and write, the only skill I have is my attention and my focus, and they're writers who have much bigger social media followings. They're writers who engage a lot more with the community, and I really respect that. I just don't have the bandwidth.
Well, we appreciate you taking some of your time here at the convention to talk to us.
Oh, yeah, no, sure. Well, I'm happy to be down in Charleston,
Well, one of the things that we've found talking to a lot of other writers on our show is that they found writers groups have been tremendously helpful to them. We've had one or two that have said, not so much, and then some have said, you got to find the right group. So have you found any writers groups that have worked for you, or did you ever go that route?
I tried to avoid. Well, Clarion was a big thing for me. And you're there with other people. Everyone's writing a short story a week and critiquing each other. So that was huge for me and really helpful. After that, not so much. But I have a people who are sort of beta readers. I have a group of people, and it's not the same every book, but who usually there's 8 to 12 of them for each book, who will read things in different drafts and give me feedback. And then there's some other writers and I who are all part of an email group. And we're really able to sort of talk. We all started out around the same time, plus or minus. And we are all able to sort of give each other advice. And, do you know this editor? What happens when the publicist says this? Like, does anyone know about this bookstore? And that's actually been tremendously useful because we all care about each other, and like people have really stepped in and done solids for each other.
Okay. So you do have support from other writers that are in the same, they're kind of in that same situation.
Yeah.
And I know with the pandemic, it made it very difficult for people to meet in person. So now with the advent of Facebook groups and, Discord and all this other stuff out there, there's probably more than there have ever been out there. So, like I said, we've had writers that have just sung the praises of writers groups.
Oh, no, and I think it's really beneficial. I mean, until you're finishing stuff and other people are reading it and you're taking their feedback on board, you're not really doing the job if what you want to do is write for the market. Mm-hmm. If you want to write for self-expression or self-fulfillment, and those are really valid reasons to write, you don't need that step. But if what you want to do is your work to be read by a bigger audience, that's what you need to be doing.
It's funny when you're talking about writing for the market. Right after the pandemic, we were doing a panel with a couple of other authors. Well, should I say the Halfling was doing a panel with a couple of, I was sitting in the audience. And one of the authors was actually making his living writing fiction for game books, blurbs of fiction. And he was talking about how much money he was making and really extolling the virtues of doing this.
Sure.
Very little effort. You write these little blurbs for books, a paragraph or two, sometimes a few pages for flavor text. And they pay you, and he was saying, I'm doing this for a living. More people should do this.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, there's all different kinds of writing you can do. I mean, there's people who make their living writing comics. There's people who make their living writing for game books. One of my friends from Clarion, who's very close, he's a narrative designer for video games. Everything from a stupid thing he's done jobs for a game you play on your phone, all the way up to he was one of the writers for the last Harry Potter sort of massive multiplayer online game. So, writing for the market takes all kinds of different forms. But, and I don't mean it to sound crass. I know saying market, it's just like you're writing for an audience that's not you.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, have you ever experienced toxicity or gatekeeping in your writing? Because we talk a lot about that within the scope of fandom and the fandom community, specifically, for instance, cosplay, where people say, you can't wear that costume because you don't look like that character, you're not the right color, you're not the right gender, et cetera. And we've heard from writers, especially those that are underrepresented, that there is gatekeeping within that. Have you had any experience?
Or have you witnessed it?
Well, I'm a white guy, so I don't experience a lot of toxicity. No, it makes it easy for me. No, I haven't. And, I know that there's a lot of gatekeeping in certain places in horror. But at the same time, okay. Those are pretty limited, and most of the people I know in the horror community really push to be more inclusive. The best thing that's happened, I think, in publishing in a long time is there's been a huge push for more diverse voices, and I don't think. I know that in and of itself, there is a good in that. For me, I don't care about that good. I'm very selfish. I just want new stories. I want stories I haven't read before. I've read a white dude's haunted house story. I want to read an Asian American haunted house story. I want to read a Blackfoot haunted house story. I want to read a Black American haunted house story. I want to read something that I haven't seen again and again and again. And so to me, that push is really just benefits my entertainment bottom line. Well, even taking genre in a new direction. Don't have to reinvent the genre, but to do something new with it. One of the things that I like about horror is we've got these tropes that have lasted for a very, very long time. Science fiction isn't quite as lucky. Horror's got about 100 years on science fiction. Fantasy's got about 80 years on science fiction. But there's these long-standing tropes that have been around forever. Ghosts, haunted houses, vampires, werewolves. And every generation reinvents those, does something new with them at its best. So that's what I'm talking about, is sort of seeing what people do with the toys in the toy box. If someone's going to come up with a new genre, I'd be really interested, though. I want to see that.
So let's talk about some of the challenges that you have faced and how you've been able to overcome them. And we've kind of touched on some of it, but really kind of get into sort of the difficulties that you've experienced.
Really, they're mostly self-imposed. I find any job has its difficulties. My wife's a chef. So she comes home at, for a long time, midnight, 1 a.m. She's got burns, she's got cuts, she's been on her feet for a 8 to 12 hour shift. And I'm like, I've been sitting in an ergonomic chair typing and my fingers hurt. She has very little sympathy. And so I could be working at McDonald's, I could be working outdoors. I got a sit down job at a desk. Any difficulties are negligible. Did you have any difficulties specifically in mind? Maybe I'm missing them.
Well, no, we've heard from writers that time management was one of their big challenges.
Sure. Absolutely, but that's sort of like, I don't know. That's like saying a difficulty with eating a really nice meal is knowing when to stop. Time management is just time management. Either you want to write books or you don't. And if you want to, you manage your time to do so, It can be a pain in the ass sometimes. I want to go watch a movie. I don't want to sit here and write, but I'm sure lots of people feel that way. I'm sure lots of ER doctors feel that way. They'd rather be on their boat with a beer.
I feel that way about editing the podcast every week. Man, why am I doing this?
Exactly. So time management, you either learn it or you don't. If people are just starting out writing, I have infinite patience and unlimited empathy for them, because I do think it's hard to figure out writing. Once you start doing it for a living, my empathy and patience runs out, because you're either going to do the job or you're not.
Yeah. And that's something that we have heard before. If you're going to be a writer, you have to put your butt in the chair and put your fingers on the keyboard and just get to it.
If what you want to be doing is writing to pay the bills, right? I mean, there's plenty of people out there. And one of the things, I try not to do writing workshops very often because I don't think I'm a very good teacher. But one of the things I always say to people at the beginning is, why are you writing? Because some people, they've got one story they really want to tell. And other people, it's self-expression, which is really important to them. Other people they just want to try it. They just want to feel more comfortable with it. They just want to not did not feel like the blank page is an enemy to them. And other people want to write to sell to the market or to be read by other people. And those are all really different reasons, and that come with a really varied set of approaches, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And we have had the opportunity to talk to so many writers, and every one of them has, different perspectives, their stories, their journeys into their writing, on their writing path is different. So what you've said is kind of encompassing all of what we have heard. I appreciate you kind of condensing that for the folks that may not have heard some of those episodes. But what's been the biggest surprise for you in your writing journey?
That anyone gives a shit. I mean, honestly, I did a book called My Best Friend's Exorcism that was kind of my second novel. And that one, it was a really, I had a hard time with that book. And at a certain point, I started really putting in my life. One of the characters has terrible acne in it. I had terrible acne as a kid. I mean, really to the point of real despair as a teenager. How am I going to walk out the door looking like a pustulent monster? And I realized that the more stuff I put in that was personal and the deeper it cut, the more that people responded to it. And it's one reason I'm having such a hard time with this Witchcraft book is, that I'm realizing very late in the game is it's set in a home for unwed mothers in 1970. And I have two relatives who were both sent away, as they call it, who we didn't know anything about this until much later in their lives. They're both dead now. And so the reason I'm writing the book comes from a fair amount of anger over hearing what had happened to them. Because whether the homes were good or bad, whether they were necessary or not, and I get the argument. I don't feel a lot of empathy or sympathy, or I don't feel a lot of sympathy for the argument that, well, a 15-year-old shouldn't be having a baby. Well, then maybe someone shouldn't be getting that 15-year-old pregnant. It's also plenty of 15-year-olds have babies and their families raise them. These girls did not have to be sent away and treated as criminals for their lives not to be ruined. But I also get the other side of that argument that, if they had stayed home wherever it was, then neighbors would have judged them. It would have made life much harder for them and their lives would have been ruined. I get both sides of that. I don't know which is right, but I do know in my heart, unequivocally at a bottom line, as one of these women said, there was a woman who wrote a history of them, and she was talking to one of the women who was sent away, I think in Oklahoma, to a home. She said, I didn't give up my baby. My baby was taken from me. And no one, and I know this in my heart, no one should have to look at their child and say, I don't want you. That just shouldn't happen. But it's been very hard for me in a book, as a childless middle-aged man, in a book where every single character is pregnant, to really connect with that personally. And it's what I've really been struggling with, because I know that is what readers want. They want to see your blood on the page. And so much of this book is motivated by anger, which is not an attractive emotion. And my editor is a very nice person, but she's not comfortable with anger. And so it's been a real struggle with this book, because on the one hand, it's very personal, but in a kind of ugly way. And on the other hand, it's hard for me to get that personal stuff into it because the experience of my characters is so different from mine. So it's been a struggle, but that's been the biggest surprise. That personal stuff, that stuff I think is ugly, that stuff I'm ashamed of in my life, that's the stuff people connect with. There's a character in a book I did called The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, Freudian slip, my Southern Book Club. Who's an older woman, Miss Mary, who's a grandmother living with a family. She's got dementia. And she's out of her mind. And she's based on my grandmother who lived with us and had dementia. And hated her. I was really scared of her. She was angry and violent because she was so frustrated by her condition. And I largely wrote the book and put her in it to try to give her some respect and dignity that I had certainly never given her in her life. And a lot of characters really connect with her. And so I was very worried about putting something that I was so ashamed of and so ashamed of how I felt about her, she was a woman who loved me very much before she got dementia. But putting that in there, people connect with it, but it was hard. But that's what people connect with has been the surprise to me.
Well, I mean, it doesn't surprise me as a very avid reader, because that's what attracts me to books is when I find a character in a book that I'm reading and I can see either a little bit of myself or somebody that I know is in that book. It makes it even more, compelling and makes me more want to finish the book. So, I mean, it's not really a surprise to me. I think that it probably, in some ways, made it more difficult for you, but did you find too that maybe some of it was a little bit easier for you in some ways? Or maybe not easier, therapeutic?
Not so much therapeutic, but once you get past that initial threshold of resistance because you're ashamed of something, it becomes easier because it's all sitting right there. You've just been ignoring it for a long time. But yeah, easier and harder.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is such a useless answer. Easier and harder. That tells no one nothing. There's no useful information there.
You're sounding like a Genesis car commercial.
Well, do you have a specific writer that has inspired you?
Yeah, who's your author crush?
Man, there's so many. Always at different times, a different writer. I did this thing where I was reading Stephen King in order and writing about it to do this reread for a website called Tor that was kind of, paying my grocery bills every month. And I started it just to make a little money, and it wound up taking me about 5 years. And in that 5-year period, I went from just being sort of a guy trying to be a writer to a guy with a couple of novels under his belt. And that was a 5-year period of a lot of change, but Stephen King, reading these big fat Stephen King books was a consistent thing over those years. So during that time, he really was. Shirley Jackson for Southern Book Club's Guide to Slam. I would just keep reading her and reading her and reading her. For the book I'm doing right now, it's been really hard, but I'm finding that what's really been motivating me is there are several memoirs written by women who are witches or self-proclaimed witches that I found really useful to keep reading during that. So it's always someone different in there. I always kind of have a spirit animal writer for a book.
No. Okay. And if you had to pick one thing that you have written that defines you as a writer, I'm putting you on the spot here. I can tell it's a very difficult question, just by the look on your face. Can you tell us what that might be?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to change the question a little bit because I don't know how to define. I don't know how to define myself. You know what I mean? I have a rough idea of where I exist, but I've never read a review. I just don't read reviews. I don't read online comments. I don't know what the perception of me as a writer is. I don't know how to define myself, but I will say, the book I'm most proud of and the book that means the most to me is We Sold Our Souls. And then many, many years ago, I wrote a short story called Mofongo Knows about a hyper-intelligent gorilla who was dying. And that was really the first thing, the second thing really, but the first one of any note that I ever felt like, oh, that's a story. That's something that's out in the world that I'm not ashamed of. So those two things really meant a lot to me. In terms of what defines me, to me, that's the next thing I'm working on,
I got you. And here's another one. Well, actually, I think you already answered this. If you couldn't make a career as a writer, what would your next choice be for a career?
I'd be really unhappy. I don't know. I mean, up until I would say 2017, 2018, somewhere in there, I was really considering giving it up and going to law school. It was really, the books weren't making a lot of money. It was really a struggle. So it would have been law school just because, I've got a skill set. I can talk, I can write, I can read. Sounds like a lawyer to me.
It's funny, Grady. One of our people we interviewed last year was a lawyer who gave up practicing law to become a writer.
That fool.
He's actually much happier now. Much.
It is much happier.
And to be honest, I'm actually working on my next career. I'm going to give up being a spaceman and become an ancient astronaut theorist. That's my goal.
Get that Chariots of the Gods action going. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if it worked for Eric Von Daniken, it can work for me.
Yeah.
He's got to get the hair. He's got to work on getting that hair,
Yeah, that Von Daniken theory I find terrifying.
But anyway, this is about Grady, not about the spaceman.
Well, we're going to start wrapping it up here, but do you have any one piece of advice for writers that are just starting out?
Well, I wouldn't say it's advice, but writing is. I thought writing is really. There's no point in doing it unless you're in it. It's not a hobby. To me, writing is really serious. You don't need anything to write. You don't need anything except something to make marks with and something to make marks on. And even then, there are people who make their livings as storytellers or you need to be telling a story. You don't even need an audience. There's plenty of writers who wrote books that weren't read or discovered or appreciated till years after they were dead. All you need to do is have the will to make a mark on the world. And writing is the most dangerous and important thing you can do. It is your way to impose your will on the world. Every revolution, everything that's changed society has started out as an idea and then usually progressed to something that's written. There is a reason that in colonial governments or totalitarian governments, they put restrictions first on writing and reading. It is incredibly important. And I couldn't sit down and do what I do, even though I write goofy books about, vampires and book clubs and witches and all that stuff. I couldn't do it unless it was the most important thing in my life. And I think for anyone doing it, I spent many years wasting time being embarrassed or bashful about thinking it was important. And if you can skip a lot of those years and get a head start on where I was, just realize that what you're doing as you sit down, it matters. It's important. One of the most amazing things I've read recently is a series of letters that were never mailed, written by a woman in a home for unwed mothers in 1958. And they're important. She wrote them to no one. She wrote them to a baby who would never read them, but they are enormously important. Every time you sit down, what you're doing matters.
I'm not sure where to go after that. Well, it's very powerful. It was very, there's a lot of power in that.
But Halfling, I think it's time for us to go ahead and wrap up. So Grady, where can we find your works and how can we find out more about you?
I don't know why you would want to, but if you have a masochistic streak, just GradyHendrix.com. It's all my social media. Goop is there. All my links to all my books. A lot of extra writing I've done. All of it's GradyHendrix.com.
And we will definitely get that in the show notes. And hope that everybody here and everybody listening out there gets a chance to check out Grady's works.
Everybody, let's give Grady Hendrix a big hand.
And we want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today in real life. Woohoo!
Hey, no, it's I haven't been on Rivers Avenue in a couple of hot minutes, so it's fun to be back out here.
That's wonderful. Well, we also want to thank our listeners and for our folks in the audience today. We hope that y'all will enjoy the rest of the convention. We're here at Atomacon in North Charleston, South Carolina, and we're thanking Grady Hendrix one more time. And this is the Halfling and the Spaceman, over and out.
Hey, that's my line.